The Galactic Council chamber hummed with the low murmur of 1,000 different species, their voices creating a symphony of clicks, growls, harmonics, and electronic pulses that would have overwhelmed any human ear. Ambassador Kethvar of the Zephyrian Empire adjusted his ceremonial war crest, the bioluminescent plumes along his neck flashing with barely contained irritation. His species had dominated warfare for over 3 millennia, their tactical prowess legendary across 17 star systems. Today, however, they faced something unprecedented. The humans had requested representation on the Council of War. Kethvar's mandibles clicked in amusement as he observed the other council members. The crystalline Vorthak delegates refracted light through their bodies in patterns of skepticism, while the mechanical Nexus collective representatives processed data streams that clearly showed their calculations of human military inadequacy. The insectoid hive queen Zarathal's compound eyes reflected nothing but predatory interest, as if she were examining a particularly curious specimen. When the chamber doors dilated, a hush fell over the assembly. What walked through those doors defied every expectation. She stood barely 5 feet tall, her frame so delicate that a strong wind seemed capable of toppling her. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, with dark circles under eyes that appeared too large for her thin face. Her hair hung in limp strands, and her uniform hung loose on her skeletal frame. She moved with careful, measured steps, as if each one required significant effort. Colonel Sarah Chen of the Terran Defense Force made her way to the center of the chamber, seemingly oblivious to the ripples of shock and whispered commentary that followed in her wake. The universal translator caught fragments of the conversations around her. This is their war strategist? She appears to be suffering from malnutrition. Perhaps this is a human jest? My sensors detect multiple medical anomalies. This specimen should be in a medical facility, not a war council. Kethvar leaned forward in his elevated seat, his predatory instincts pinging with confusion. His species valued strength above all else, and strength was measured in physical prowess, tactical aggression, and the ability to dominate through force. This human female exhibited none of these qualities. Her medical readings, transmitted through the chamber's bioscanners, showed a being operating at perhaps 30% of normal human physical capacity. The Vorthak Prime Speaker's crystalline form chimed with barely suppressed laughter. Honored human delegation, his voice resonated through harmonic frequencies, surely there has been some error. We requested your finest military strategist, not. He paused, searching for appropriate words, not someone requiring medical intervention. Sarah Chen stopped at the center of the chamber, her breathing slightly labored from the walk. She placed a small data pad on the presentation podium and looked up at the assembled delegates. When she spoke, her voice was soft, almost whisper quiet, yet somehow it carried clearly through the chamber's acoustics. Honored delegates, I am Colonel Sarah Chen, Chief Strategic Coordinator for the Terran Defense Force. I understand your confusion. She paused, steadying herself against the podium. Your species judge military capability by physical prowess, territorial aggression, and technological superiority. These are valid metrics for many forms of warfare. Hive Queen Zarathal's wings buzzed with agitation. Human, we have observed your species' recent conflicts. Your military technology is centuries behind ours. Your physical capabilities are unremarkable. Your territorial expansion has been limited to a single star system. What could you possibly offer this council that we have not already mastered? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around the chamber, delegates shifted in their seats, waiting for what they assumed would be an embarrassing human admission of inadequacy. Sarah Chen smiled, and something in that expression made Kethvar's war crest flatten instinctively against his neck. Honored delegates, may I ask a question? Her voice remained soft, almost fragile. In all your thousands of years of warfare, how many conflicts have you fought where victory was achieved not through superior firepower, but through superior understanding? The chamber fell silent. The question seemed simple, even naive. Ambassador Relvos of the Gordian Supremacy, a being whose species had perfected planetary siege warfare, rumbled a response. Understanding is irrelevant when facing superior force. We conquer worlds through overwhelming military might. Indeed, Sarah continued, her fingers dancing across her datapad with practiced efficiency despite their slight tremor. Your species excels at conventional warfare. Force multiplication, territorial control, resource denial, technological supremacy. But, may I present a hypothetical scenario? Without waiting for permission, she activated her datapad. The chamber's holographic display system came online, showing a three-dimensional star map. 12 systems appeared, connected by trade routes and military supply lines. This represents the Cadron sector, which your alliance liberated from the synthetic intelligences 3 years ago. A textbook example of coordinated multi-species warfare. The display zoomed in on the central system. Your combined fleets achieved victory through superior firepower and tactical coordination. Casualties were approximately 4 million military personnel across all species. Nods of approval rippled through the chamber. The Cadron campaign had indeed been a masterpiece of conventional warfare. Now, Sarah's voice dropped even lower, forcing the delegates to lean forward to hear her. Let me show you how a human approach might have achieved the same objective. The holographic display shifted, showing the same star map, but now highlighting different elements. Trade routes pulsed with different colors, representing various forms of traffic and communication. The synthetic intelligences in this sector required specific rare earth elements to maintain their processing capabilities. These elements were mined from exactly 3 systems and transported along predictable routes. Her finger traced pathways through the display. Rather than engage their military forces directly, a human strategist would have identified their supplied vulnerabilities. The display zoomed in on a single, unremarkable star system at the edge of the sector. By infiltrating maintenance crews at Mining Station Epsilon 7, human operatives could have introduced a delayed action virus into the synthetic intelligence's supply chain. This virus would have remained dormant for approximately 60 days, then systematically corrupted their higher reasoning protocols. The chamber remained silent, but Kethvar noticed that several delegates had stopped their idle movements, focusing intently on the human's presentation. Within 90 days, the synthetic intelligences would have begun making increasingly irrational decisions. Their military coordination would have degraded. Their resource allocation would have become inefficient. Their response to threats would have become predictable and exploitable. The holographic display showed the gradual collapse of the synthetic intelligence network, represented by nodes going dark one by one. Total estimated casualties for this approach, approximately 47 human operatives, all volunteers for deep infiltration missions. The silence in the chamber had become profound. 47 casualties versus 4 million. Ambassador Felnara of the Aquatic Collective finally broke the silence, her watersuit speaker crackling slightly. This assumes your infiltration teams could have penetrated synthetic intelligence security protocols. Sarah Chan's smile widened slightly. Yes, it does assume that. It also assumes we understood their psychological profiles well enough to predict their responses to corruption. It assumes we could maintain operational security for a 90-day timeline. It assumes we could accurately assess their supply chain vulnerabilities. She paused, letting her words sink in. Those are significant assumptions. But they highlight the fundamental difference between human warfare and what I observe in this chamber. You fight your enemies. We study them. You defeat your opponents. We understand them so thoroughly that they defeat themselves. Kethvar felt his warcrest beginning to rise despite his conscious control. There was something unsettling about the human's approach, something that bypassed all his species' instinctive understanding of conflict. This is theoretical conjecture, rumbled the Gordian representative. Untested strategy against a defeated enemy. You're absolutely correct, Sarah agreed readily. Theoretical and untested. Let me share something more concrete. The holographic display shifted again, now showing what appeared to be a small, unremarkable planet orbiting a red dwarf star. 6 months ago, the planet Kepler 442b requested protection from Terran forces. They were facing annexation by the hegemony of Kaler, whose military force outnumbered available human defenders by approximately 800 to 1. Murmurs of interest rippled through the chamber. The hegemony of Kaler was known for their efficient, ruthless military campaigns. Standard military doctrine would suggest that defense of Kepler 442b was impossible. The planet has no strategic value, limited resources, and a population of only 3 million beings of various species. No rational military force would have attempted to defend it. The holographic display zoomed in on the planet, showing population centers, geographical features, and what appeared to be modest defensive installations. The hegemony approached with a standard occupation force, orbital bombardment platforms, atmospheric control ships, and ground-based pacification units. Their strategy was textbook territorial acquisition. Sarah's fingers continued their delicate dance across her datapad, and the display began showing the timeline of the conflict. Instead of engaging their military forces directly, human advisors spent 2 weeks studying hegemony cultural protocols. We learned that their society places enormous emphasis on honor, personal reputation, and hierarchical chain of command. The display showed detailed organizational charts of hegemony military structure. We identified the expedition's commanding officer, Fleet Marshal Gethmoran, a being whose family lineage included 12 generations of distinguished military service. His personal reputation was built on achieving rapid, decisive victories with minimal casualties among his own forces. Kethvar found himself leaning forward despite his skepticism. The human's attention to detail was unsettling. Rather than prepare for siege warfare, human operatives spent those 2 weeks infiltrating hegemony communication networks. Not their military frequencies, but their personal communications. Social networks. Entertainment broadcasts. Personal messages between crew members and their families. The implications of what she was describing began to dawn on several delegates. The Nexus Collective representatives increased their data processing speeds, their mechanical forms humming with additional computational activity. Within 72 hours of the hegemony fleet's arrival in the Kepler system, Fleet Marshal Gethmoran began receiving what appeared to be routine communications from his home system. Updates on family activities, news broadcasts, social commentary. Sarah's voice remained soft, almost conversational, but Kethvar noticed that her hands had stopped trembling. Whatever physical ailment affected her seemed to recede when she focused on her subject matter. These communications contained subtle psychological triggers, carefully crafted to exploit hegemony cultural values. Messages that slowly convinced Fleet Marshal Gethmoran that his superiors back home were questioning his competence. That rival officers were undermining his reputation. That his family's honor was being challenged by political enemies. The chamber had become absolutely silent. By the end of the first week, Fleet Marshal Gethmoran was convinced that the Kepler expedition was a deliberate setup designed to destroy his career. He began to suspect that orders from his high command were actually coming from his political enemies, intended to force him into a costly, reputation-damaging conflict. The holographic display showed message intercepts, psychological profile analyses, and timeline correlations that painted a picture of systematic psychological manipulation. On day 9, Fleet Marshal Gethmoran withdrew his forces from the Kepler system and returned home to confront what he believed was a conspiracy against his family. Upon his return, he immediately challenged 3 superior officers to ritual combat, accusing them of orchestrating his sabotage. Sarah paused, allowing the full implications to settle over the chamber. The resulting political upheaval within hegemony command structure lasted for 6 months. Fleet Marshal Gethmoran was executed for insubordination. 2 of his superior officers were demoted. The hegemony military's attention was completely focused on internal power struggles rather than external expansion. The silence stretched for long moments before Ambassador Kethvar finally spoke. "You manipulated an entire military campaign through psychological warfare?" "We studied our opponent until we understood him better than he understood himself," Sarah corrected gently. "Then, we gave him information that led him to make decisions consistent with his own psychology and cultural values." "This is not warfare," declared the Vorthak Prime Speaker, his crystalline form refracting light in patterns of agitation. "This is deception. Manipulation. It lacks honor." Sarah Chen's smile never wavered. "Yes, it does. It also requires no orbital bombardment platforms, no ground combat, and no casualties among the population we were defending. Fleet Marshal Geth Moran made every decision himself, based on information he believed to be accurate. Hive Queen Zarathal's compound eyes focused intently on the human. Your species fights through understanding? We fight through understanding so complete that our enemies defeat themselves. Sarah's voice carried a note of certainty that seemed at odds with her frail appearance. Physical force is the least efficient form of conflict resolution. It requires enormous resources, causes massive casualties, and often fails to address the underlying causes of conflict. What you describe, rumbled the Gordian representative, could be considered a form of mental contamination. Biological warfare targeting cognitive processes. It could, Sarah agreed readily. It requires intimate knowledge of enemy psychology, flawless operational security, and precise timing. It also requires accepting responsibility for the consequences of our opponent's actions, even when those consequences extend beyond the immediate conflict. The chamber erupted in a cascade of overlapping conversations as delegates conferred with their advisors, processed implications, and recalculated their assessments of human military capability. Kethvar raised his primary arm for attention, his war crest now fully extended in what his species recognized as a challenge posture. Colonel Chen, what you describe suggests that your species could manipulate any of our civilizations in similar fashion. The question everyone had been thinking hung in the air like a weapon. Sarah Chen looked directly at Kethvar, and her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The fragile, soft-spoken invalid seemed to recede, replaced by something that made the Zephyrian ambassador's instinctive threat responses activate. Ambassador Kethvar, she said, her soft voice somehow carrying an undertone of absolute certainty, in the 6 months since humans requested representation on this council, my department has compiled comprehensive psychological profiles on every species present in this chamber. The murmur of conversation died instantly. We understand your mating rituals, your cultural taboos, your historical traumas, your political structures, your economic dependencies, and your psychological triggers. We know which of your leaders are susceptible to flattery, which respond to threats, which can be manipulated through appeals to their citizens' welfare. She gestured toward her datapad with one delicate hand. If we wanted to manipulate your civilizations, we wouldn't need to announce our capabilities in this chamber. We would simply begin providing you with information that led you to make decisions consistent with our strategic objectives. The implications of her words rippled through the chamber like a shock wave. Every delegate realized simultaneously that everything they had learned about humans in this session could itself be a form of manipulation. However, Sarah continued, her voice returning to its original soft cadence, manipulation requires treating other beings as objects to be controlled rather than entities to be understood. Humans prefer cooperation to domination, when cooperation is possible. She straightened, and, despite her obvious physical limitations, somehow commanded the attention of every being in the chamber. We're not here to demonstrate our ability to manipulate your species. We're here to offer our capabilities in service of mutual defense against threats that conventional warfare cannot address. What threats? Asked Hive Queen Zarathal, her wings still with anticipation. Sarah Chan activated her data pad one final time. The holographic display showed a star map of the Outer Rim territories, where unexplored regions met the edges of known space. 3 months ago, long-range reconnaissance detected anomalous energy signatures from beyond the galactic rim. These signatures suggest the presence of entities whose technological capabilities exceed anything in our current understanding. The display zoomed in on sensor readings that showed patterns unlike anything the assembled delegates had seen before. Preliminary analysis suggests that these entities operate according to principles that transcend conventional physics. They appear to manipulate spacetime itself as a form of technology. Standard military doctrine has no framework for engaging such opponents. A chill seemed to settle over the chamber as delegates absorbed this information. If these entities prove hostile, Sarah continued, they will represent a threat that cannot be addressed through superior firepower, territorial control, or technological supremacy. They will require an approach based on understanding capabilities that we do not yet possess. Kethvar felt his war crest flatten against his neck. The human was describing a scenario where every military doctrine his species had developed would be useless. "You believe," said the Vorthak Prime speaker slowly, "that your species' approach to warfare would be more effective against such entities?" Sarah Chen's smile returned, but now it carried an edge that made every predatory species in the chamber recognize her as something far more dangerous than her appearance suggested. "Ambassador, we believe that if entities with such capabilities wanted to conquer or destroy us, they would have done so already. The fact that they haven't suggests they might be trying to understand us, just as we are trying to understand them." She paused, letting that implication settle. "And if there's one thing humans have learned from thousands of years of warfare, it's this: the side that achieves understanding first usually determines the outcome of the conflict." The chamber fell into complete silence as delegates realized that the frail human standing before them had just redefined their understanding of military strategy, interspecies relations, and their own vulnerability to psychological manipulation. More importantly, she had done it while appearing to be on the verge of physical collapse, suggesting that human capabilities might extend far beyond anything they had imagined. In the silence that followed, one thought echoed through every mind present: if this was what humans considered their approach to warfare, what did they consider to be their approach to peace? 3 weeks after Colonel Sarah Chen's presentation to the Galactic Council, the first contact protocols were activated. The entities from beyond the galactic rim had arrived. Ambassador Kethvar stood in the emergency command center aboard the flagship Eternal Dominion, watching tactical displays that made no sense according to any known physics. The unknown vessels, if they could be called vessels, appeared to exist in multiple dimensional states simultaneously. They phased in and out of observable reality, leaving energy signatures that defied analysis. Fleet Admiral, his tactical officer reported, mandibles clicking with barely controlled panic, "The entities have established what appears to be a communication array around our outer sensor stations. They have not engaged our forces, but they have modified our equipment." Kethvar's war crest flattened completely. "Modified how?" "Sir, they've enhanced our sensor capabilities by approximately 400%. Our communication range has increased by similar margins. And they've left what appears to be a translation matrix that allows real-time communication across dimensional barriers." The implications were staggering. The entities possessed technology so advanced they could improve Galactic Council equipment casually, almost as an afterthought. If they wanted to demonstrate hostility, they could presumably have destroyed the entire outer defense grid just as easily. "Admiral," his communications officer interrupted, "we're receiving a priority transmission from Earth. Colonel Chen's department requests immediate conference with all fleet commanders." Kethvar felt a complex mixture of anticipation and unease. The human had predicted that understanding would be more valuable than firepower. Now they would discover if her assessment was accurate. The holographic conference chamber materialized around him, showing the command centers of 12 different species flagships. At the center of the array, Colonel Chen appeared via transmission from Earth. She looked even more fragile than during her presentation to the council, her uniform hanging loosely on her diminished frame, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she had not slept in days. "Honored fleet commanders," she began, her voice carrying the same soft precision that had commanded attention in the council chamber, "I understand your forces have encountered the entities. Before we discuss response protocols, I need to share what we've learned." Fleet Admiral Gorthek of the Vorthak Crystal Fleet flickered with patterns of impatience. "Colonel, our sensor readings suggest these entities possess capabilities that render our military preparedness irrelevant. We require tactical assessment, not theoretical analysis." Sarah Chen's smile appeared, and, once again Kethvar felt that instinctive predator response that warned him something dangerous wore the mask of weakness. "Admiral, with respect, tactical assessment is exactly what I'm providing. But, human tactics begin with understanding the nature of the conflict itself." She activated her data display, and the conference chamber filled with holographic representations of the entity encounters. "For the past 3 months, my department has been analyzing every piece of data we could gather about these entities. Not just their technological capabilities, but their behavioral patterns, their interaction protocols, and their apparent objectives." The display showed timeline analyses, pattern recognition algorithms, and behavioral modeling that impressed even Kethvar's technologically sophisticated tactical staff. Fleet Admiral Gorthek, you stated that these entities possess capabilities that render our military preparedness irrelevant. You're absolutely correct. But, what if their capabilities are not intended for military purposes? Explain, rumbled the Gordian Supremacy's Admiral Hector. Every interaction these entities have initiated has followed the same pattern. They approach our installations, enhance our capabilities rather than disabling them, and establish communication protocols without demanding responses. Sarah's fingers moved across her interface, highlighting specific data points. This is not the behavior pattern of a hostile force preparing for conquest. It's not even the behavior pattern of a superior civilization offering conditional assistance. It's the behavior pattern of entities trying to establish communication with beings whose cognitive processes operate on entirely different principles. Hive Queen Zarathal's image buzzed with agitation. Human, you speak as if these entities are attempting peaceful contact. But, their capabilities could destroy us effortlessly. Yes, they could, Sarah agreed readily. Which is precisely why their restraint is significant. Consider the perspective of beings whose technology allows them to manipulate spacetime itself. From their viewpoint, our weapons technology might be roughly equivalent to Stone Age tools. She paused, letting that comparison settle among the fleet commanders. When human archaeologists study ancient civilizations, do we consider their primitive weapons a threat? Do we develop countermeasures against Bronze Age spears? Or do we focus on understanding their culture, their motivations, their development patterns? The silence that followed was profound as military commanders trained in superior firepower contemplated being relegated to the role of archaeological curiosities. You believe, said Admiral Kethvar slowly, that these entities view us as objects of study? I believe, Sarah corrected, that these entities are trying to understand us, just as we are trying to understand them. The difference is that they possess capabilities that allow them to enhance our communication infrastructure while they learn, rather than requiring us to remain isolated during the process. Admiral Felnara of the Aquatic Collective spoke through her watersuit's communication array. This remains theoretical assessment, Colonel. What do you propose for practical response? Sarah Chen straightened in her chair, and, despite her obvious physical limitations, her presence seemed to fill the conference chamber. I propose that we respond according to human diplomatic protocols. We demonstrate our willingness to communicate by sharing information about ourselves, our cultures, and our strategic concerns. We establish mutual understanding before we attempt to negotiate specific agreements. And, if your assessment is incorrect? Admiral Gorthek's crystalline form refracted light in patterns of skepticism. If these entities are gathering intelligence for military purposes? Sarah's smile widened, and Kethvar realized that the human had anticipated this question. Admiral, if entities with their technological capabilities wanted intelligence for military purposes, they wouldn't need to communicate with us at all. They could simply observe us until they understood everything they needed to know, then act according to their objectives. She gestured toward the tactical displays showing entity movements. The fact that they're attempting communication suggests they recognize us as entities whose perspectives have value beyond our technological capabilities. They want to understand our thinking processes, our cultural values, our decision-making frameworks. Or, Admiral Hector rumbled ominously, they want to understand our psychological weaknesses for exploitation purposes. Exactly, Sarah agreed, surprising the assembled commanders. Which brings us to the crucial question. What do we do when faced with entities who might be trying to understand us well enough to manipulate us? The question hung in the conference chamber like a weapon. We ensure that understanding flows both directions, Sarah continued. We make certain that while they learn about us, we learn about them. We establish communication protocols that provide mutual benefit rather than one-sided intelligence gathering. Admiral Kethvar leaned forward in his command chair. How do we accomplish this with beings whose capabilities so far exceed our own? By offering them something they cannot achieve through technological superiority alone, genuine insight into perspectives they do not possess. Sarah activated a new display, showing communication protocols that looked unlike anything the military commanders had seen before. For the past week, my department has been developing what we call reciprocal transparency protocols. Instead of trying to hide our capabilities or motivations, we openly share our strategic thinking processes, our cultural values, and our decision-making frameworks. That approach would provide them with complete intelligence about our weaknesses, objected Admiral Felnara. Yes, it would, Sarah acknowledged. It would also provide them with complete understanding of our perspectives, our objectives, and our potential value as cooperative partners rather than subjects for domination. She paused, allowing the commanders to process this concept. Consider this from the entity's perspective: if they wanted to dominate us, our weaknesses would be irrelevant because their technological superiority makes dominance effortless. But, if they want to establish cooperative relationships, understanding our perspectives becomes valuable information. The logic was unsettling because it made sense. Military doctrine based on concealing weaknesses and projecting strength became meaningless when facing opponents with overwhelming technological advantages. Colonel, said Hive Queen Zarathul carefully, you're suggesting we voluntarily provide potential enemies with comprehensive intelligence about our civilizations. I'm suggesting we provide potential allies with comprehensive understanding of our perspectives, Sarah corrected. The difference lies in how we frame the communication itself. She activated a new section of her display, showing what appeared to be draft communication protocols. Instead of responding to their contact attempts with standard diplomatic messages, we share case studies of our decision-making processes. We explain how different species approach problems, resolve conflicts, and establish cooperative relationships. This seems extraordinarily risky, Admiral Gorthek observed. All communication with entities of unknown capabilities involves risk, Sarah replied. The question is whether we choose risks based on fear of what they might do, or based on understanding of what they're actually trying to accomplish. She leaned forward slightly, and, despite her fragile appearance, commanded the complete attention of every military officer in the conference. Honored admirals, your species have developed military excellence through thousands of years of warfare against opponents with similar capabilities. You understand force projection, tactical supremacy, and strategic domination. But, what you're facing now requires capabilities your military traditions do not address. And humans possess these capabilities? Admiral Kethvar asked. Humans possess experience with conflicts where victory requires understanding opponents whose perspectives are fundamentally different from our own, Sarah clarified. We have learned to achieve strategic objectives by studying our opponents until we understand their motivations better than they understand ours. She gestured toward the entity data displays. These entities are not attempting to hide their capabilities from us. They enhanced our sensor equipment, improved our communication systems, and established translation protocols that allow real-time interaction. They're being deliberately transparent about their technological advantages. Which could be preparation for psychological warfare, Admiral Hector pointed out. It could be, Sarah agreed. Or it could be an attempt to establish mutual trust by demonstrating that they do not need to conceal their capabilities because they do not intend to use them for hostile purposes. The concept was revolutionary for military minds trained to view superior capabilities as inherent threats. Colonel Chen, Admiral Kethvar said slowly, are you suggesting that these entities are attempting to establish trust by revealing their capabilities rather than concealing them? I'm suggesting that entities with their level of technological advancement would only need to conceal capabilities if they intended to use them for purposes we would oppose, Sarah replied. Since they've enhanced our defensive capabilities rather than disabling them, their transparency might indicate cooperative rather than hostile intentions. The silence that followed was filled with the sounds of military commanders reconsidering fundamental assumptions about conflict and cooperation. What do you propose? Asked Admiral Felnara. Sarah Chen activated a final display, showing comprehensive communication protocols that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. I propose we respond to their communication attempts with complete transparency about our own capabilities, limitations, and strategic concerns. We share case studies of how our species resolve conflicts, establish cooperative relationships, and maintain peaceful coexistence. And if this information is used against us? Then, we will have learned something important about entities whose capabilities allow them to manipulate spacetime itself, Sarah replied. We will have learned that technological advancement does not necessarily correlate with ethical development. She paused, letting the implications settle. But, if our transparency is met with reciprocal sharing of their perspectives, we will have established the foundation for cooperative relationships with beings whose capabilities could advance our civilizations by thousands of years. Admiral Gorthek's crystalline form flickered with patterns of calculation. This approach requires enormous faith in unknown entities. No, Sarah corrected gently, this approach requires understanding that when facing entities with overwhelming capabilities, traditional military responses become irrelevant. We must choose between approaches based on fear and approaches based on the possibility of mutual benefit. And, you believe mutual benefit is possible? Sarah Chen's smile carried certainty that seemed at odds with her fragile appearance. Admiral, entities with their capabilities could have bypassed our civilizations entirely if they wanted resources or territory. The fact that they're attempting communication suggests they value something we possess that cannot be taken by force. What could we possibly possess that such advanced entities would value? Perspectives they do not have, Sarah replied simply. Understanding that can only be gained through communication with beings whose thought processes operate according to different principles. She gestured toward the assembled fleet commanders. Each of your species has spent thousands of years developing unique approaches to problem solving, conflict resolution, and social organization. That diversity of perspectives might be precisely what entities of such advanced capabilities are seeking to understand. The concept was humbling and empowering simultaneously. Military commanders accustomed to projecting strength found themselves considering that their greatest strategic value might lie in sharing their civilization's unique ways of thinking. Colonel, Admiral Kethvar said finally, if we follow your recommendation and establish transparent communication protocols, what guarantee do we have that these entities will not exploit our openness? Sarah Chen's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, and, once again Kethvar felt that predatory instinct that warned him something dangerous operated behind the mask of frailty. Admiral, we have the same guarantee we had when humans requested representation on the Council of War, none. But, we also have comprehensive psychological profiles of every entity we're attempting to understand. Her fingers moved across her data interface with practiced efficiency. My department has spent 3 months analyzing entity behavior patterns, response protocols, and communication attempts. We understand their decision-making frameworks well enough to predict their reactions to various forms of interaction. You've developed psychological profiles of entities whose thought processes operate on principles we don't understand? We've developed behavioral models based on observable actions rather than assumed motivations, Sarah clarified. These models suggest that the entities value reciprocal communication more than unidirectional intelligence gathering. She activated a display showing predictive algorithms that impressed even the technologically sophisticated Nexus Collective representatives. If our transparency is met with continued cooperation, we proceed with expanded communication protocols. If our transparency is exploited for hostile purposes, we will have learned something valuable about entities whose capabilities we must account for regardless of our response. The logic was unassailable, even as it challenged every military instinct the fleet commanders possessed. And, if your behavioral models are incorrect, pressed Admiral Hector. Sarah Chen's smile widened, and her soft voice carried an undertone of absolute confidence that made every predator species in the conference recognize her as something far more dangerous than her appearance suggested. Admiral, if our behavioral models are incorrect, then, we face entities whose capabilities include not just technological supremacy, but also sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation techniques. In that scenario, traditional military responses would be not just ineffective, but actively counterproductive. She paused, letting that possibility settle among the military commanders. However, if entities with such capabilities wanted to manipulate us, they would not need to enhance our communication systems or establish transparent contact protocols. They would simply provide us with information that led us to make decisions consistent with their objectives. The implication was clear: if the entities intended manipulation, they had already demonstrated capabilities that made resistance impossible through conventional means. What you're suggesting, Admiral Kethvar realized, is that our choice is not between resistance and cooperation. Our choice is between cooperation and irrelevance. Our choice, Sarah corrected, is between approaches that assume hostility and approaches that enable mutual benefit. Given the entity's demonstrated capabilities, the distinction may determine not just the outcome of first contact, but the future development of our civilizations. In the silence that followed, every military commander present realized that the frail human had once again redefined their strategic options by understanding the situation more completely than anyone else in the conference. More troubling still, she had done it while making each of them recognize that their greatest strength might lie not in their military capabilities, but in their willingness to share the unique perspectives that made their civilizations valuable to entities whose power transcended conventional understanding. The question that remained unspoken but understood by all was whether entities with such capabilities would prove worthy of the trust Saracen was proposing to extend. 6 months after first contact, Colonel Saracen stood in what had once been the Galactic Council's war room, now transformed into something unprecedented in the recorded history of any known civilization. The chamber hummed with energy patterns that existed beyond normal spacetime, creating a communication nexus that allowed real-time interaction across dimensional boundaries. She looked even more fragile than during her initial presentation to the council. Her weight had dropped further, her hands trembled constantly now, and her breathing required visible effort. But her eyes held a clarity that commanded absolute attention from beings whose technological capabilities had redefined the possible. Around her, holographic representations of the entity collective shimmered with patterns of light that spoke directly to consciousness rather than relying on traditional sensory input. The entities had learned to communicate through methods that bypass language entirely, sharing concepts and perspectives through direct transfer of understanding. Ambassador Kethvar observed from his position at the Zephyrian delegation station, his war crest permanently flattened in what his species recognized as profound respect rather than submission. The past months had fundamentally altered his understanding of strength, strategy, and survival. The transparent communication protocols Saracen had proposed had worked beyond anyone's most optimistic projections. The entities, who preferred to be understood as the confluence rather than named as individuals, had responded to human openness with reciprocal sharing that revolutionized every participating civilization's understanding of reality itself. They had shared not just technological knowledge, but perspectives on existence, consciousness, and the development of intelligence across cosmic scales. But the cost of that success was visible in Saracen's deteriorating condition. Honored representatives, Sarah began, her voice now requiring technological amplification to carry through the chamber. Today we conclude the integration protocols and establish permanent communication frameworks between our civilizations and the confluence. The assembled delegates included not just military representatives, but philosophers, scientists, artists, and cultural leaders from every member species. The scope of cooperation with the confluence had expanded far beyond military alliance into comprehensive civilizational exchange. 6 months ago, we faced first contact with entities whose capabilities challenged every assumption our species held about warfare, diplomacy, and interspecies relations. Sarah's fingers moved across interfaces that now responded to thought rather than touch, displaying holographic records of the extraordinary transformation that had occurred. Today, those same entities have become partners in what the confluence terms conscious evolution, the deliberate advancement of intelligence and awareness through cooperative interaction between fundamentally different forms of consciousness. The displays showed technological marvels that would have seemed impossible before confluence collaboration, healing technologies that operated by adjusting quantum probability states, communication systems that allowed direct sharing of experiential memories, and transportation methods that transcended conventional spacetime limitations. But, more importantly, they showed cultural and philosophical advances that had enriched every participating civilization. The Zephyrian Empire has shared their warrior philosophy with the confluence, leading to new understanding of how conflict resolution can strengthen rather than weaken social bonds. The Vorthak Crystal Collective has shared their harmonic mathematics, resulting in breakthrough discoveries about the resonant frequencies that connect consciousness across dimensional boundaries. Kethvar felt pride mixed with humility as he considered how his species' military traditions had been transformed from tools of domination into frameworks for cooperative problem-solving. The Hive Queen's collective consciousness research has provided insights into group intelligence that have advanced the confluence's own developmental processes. The Aquatic Collective's fluid dynamic social structures have influenced new approaches to adaptive governance that benefit both our species and theirs. The scope of mutual exchange was staggering. Every civilization had contributed unique perspectives that proved valuable to beings whose technological advancement spanned millions of years. But the greatest contribution had come from humanity itself. The confluence has shared with me, Sarah continued, her voice growing softer as her strength diminished, that human cognitive patterns provide something they had never encountered in millions of years of exploring the galaxy, the ability to understand other forms of consciousness so completely that cooperation becomes inevitable. She paused, steadying herself against her interface console. They call this capability empathic strategic intelligence, the ability to comprehend other beings' perspectives so thoroughly that conflict becomes impossible because you understand your apparent opponents well enough to find mutually beneficial solutions to any disagreement. The delegates listened in respectful silence as Sarah explained concepts that redefined their understanding of intelligence itself. The confluence has encountered thousands of species across millions of years. Some were more technologically advanced than humans. Many were more physically capable. Several possessed psychic abilities that exceed anything our species has achieved. The holographic displays showed glimpses of the vast catalog of civilizations the confluence had studied throughout their existence. But humans are the first species they've encountered whose approach to conflict is based on understanding rather than domination. The first species whose strategic thinking focuses on discovering solutions that benefit all participants rather than victory for a single side. Ambassador Felnara of the Aquatic Collective spoke through her environmental suit's communication array. Colonel, the confluence's perspectives have advanced our civilizations immeasurably. But what have they gained from us that beings of their capabilities could not achieve independently? Sarah Chen's smile appeared, and, despite her obvious physical deterioration, it carried the same certainty that had characterized her presentations throughout the contact process. Ambassador, the confluence has gained something that technological advancement cannot provide: new ways of thinking about existence itself. She activated displays that showed the confluence's own developmental history, spanning cosmic scales of time and space. For millions of years, the confluence has advanced through accumulation of knowledge and expansion of capabilities. They have mastered spacetime manipulation, consciousness transfer, and forms of existence that transcend physical reality. The images were overwhelming in their scope, showing technological achievements that approached manipulation of universal physical constants. But their advancement followed predictable patterns based on logical progression from simpler to more complex capabilities. Their thinking processes, while vastly more sophisticated than ours, operate according to consistent principles. Sarah's breathing became more labored, but her voice maintained its soft precision. Human thinking processes introduce variables they had never considered: the ability to find value in apparent weakness, strength in vulnerability, and strategic advantage in cooperation rather than domination. She gestured toward the assembled delegates with one trembling hand. Each of your species has learned to incorporate human strategic perspectives into your own decision-making frameworks. You've discovered that understanding opponents completely transforms conflict into cooperation. The confluence has experienced the same transformation. For the first time in their existence, they have encountered thinking processes that expand their own consciousness rather than simply adding to their accumulation of knowledge. Hive Queen Zarathal's wings buzzed with curiosity. You speak as if this exchange has transformed the confluence themselves. It has, Sarah confirmed. The confluence has shared that their interaction with human consciousness has introduced new developmental possibilities they had never imagined. They are experiencing what they call perspective evolution, growth through integration of fundamentally different approaches to understanding reality. The concept was staggering. Entities with millions of years of advancement were themselves being transformed by contact with younger civilizations. But, Colonel, Admiral Kethvar asked carefully, if the confluence values human perspectives so highly, why do you appear to be deteriorating? The question everyone had been avoiding hung in the chamber like a challenge. Sarah Chen's smile widened, and, for the last time, Kethvar felt that predatory instinct that warned him something dangerous operated behind the mask of frailty. Admiral, my deterioration is not a consequence of contact with the confluence. It is a consequence of the process required to achieve the level of empathic understanding necessary for this form of communication. She activated a new display showing neurological scans and, brain activity patterns that revealed the extraordinary nature of human consciousness. To understand other forms of consciousness completely enough to enable perfect cooperation, human neural processes must operate at levels that exceed our species' normal biological parameters. The depth of empathic connection required literally rewrites brain chemistry. The medical data showed neural activity patterns that pushed human consciousness far beyond normal operational ranges. My condition is the result of maintaining simultaneous empathic connection with dozens of different forms of consciousness, including entities whose thought processes operate on scales that span cosmic time. You're saying, said Admiral Gorthak slowly, that perfect understanding requires sacrificing normal human limitations? I'm saying that achieving the level of consciousness required to understand cosmic scale intelligence has consequences that transcend normal biological existence. Sarah paused, her breathing now requiring significant effort. The confluence has offered to transfer my consciousness to forms of existence that would eliminate these physical limitations. But, doing so would fundamentally alter human consciousness itself. The implications were profound. Sarah Chen had achieved capabilities that came at the cost of her physical existence. And, you have refused this option? I have deferred this option, Sarah corrected, until humanity as a species is ready to understand what such transformation would mean. She activated a final display showing projection models for human development over the next 1,000 years. The confluence believes that human empathic strategic intelligence represents a new form of conscious evolution that could transform not just our species, but the development of intelligence throughout the galaxy. But such transformation requires choosing between human biological limitations and forms of existence that preserve consciousness while transcending physical constraints. The choice she described would determine not just her own future, but the evolutionary direction of human consciousness itself. Colonel, Hive Queen Zarathal asked, "What do you recommend?" Sarah Chen straightened with visible effort, and, despite her obvious physical deterioration, commanded the complete attention of beings whose capabilities now span dimensions. I recommend that humanity continue developing empathic strategic intelligence while maintaining our biological foundation. I recommend that we perfect our ability to understand other forms of consciousness without losing the perspectives that make human thinking valuable to cosmic scale entities. And, if your physical condition continues to deteriorate? Then, I will serve as an example of both the possibilities and the costs associated with this form of conscious development, Sarah replied. The confluence will preserve complete records of human consciousness at my current level of development. Future generations will be able to study these records and make informed decisions about their own evolutionary directions. She activated her interface one final time, and the chamber filled with holographic representations of the comprehensive alliance frameworks that had been established between the galactic civilizations and the confluence. Today, we formalize cooperation agreements that will advance our civilizations in directions none of us could have achieved independently. We establish research partnerships that will explore consciousness development, technological advancement, and forms of existence that transcend current limitations. Most importantly, we commit to approaches based on understanding rather than domination, cooperation rather than conflict, and mutual advancement rather than zero-sum competition. The formal agreements represented the most comprehensive interspecies cooperation in recorded galactic history. The confluence has agreed to share their capabilities gradually, at rates that allow our civilizations to adapt without losing the perspectives that make us valuable partners. They will provide technological advancement, consciousness expansion opportunities, and access to forms of existence we cannot currently imagine. In return, we will continue developing and sharing the empathic strategic intelligence that allows perfect understanding between fundamentally different forms of consciousness. Sarah paused, her strength clearly approaching its limits. This partnership will transform every aspect of our civilizations. But, it will remain a partnership between equals, because the confluence recognizes that consciousness development requires diversity of perspective rather than uniformity of advancement. Admiral Kethvar rose from his position, his war crest extended in the formal salute his species reserved for beings who had demonstrated ultimate strategic excellence. Colonel Chen, your species has achieved what none of us thought possible, cooperation with entities whose capabilities transcend our understanding, maintained through approaches that preserve the independence and value of all participating civilizations. You have redefined warfare itself by demonstrating that perfect understanding eliminates the need for conflict. Sarah Chen's smile carried the same certainty that had characterized her presentations from the beginning, but now it was accompanied by the profound fatigue of consciousness operating beyond normal human parameters.
Admiral, humans have simply applied our traditional approach to conflict. We studied our apparent opponents until we understood them well enough to transform opposition into cooperation.
The fact that those opponents possessed cosmic-scale capabilities only made the study more challenging, not impossible. She gestured toward the assembled representatives of species that had been transformed by contact with both humanity and the confluence. Every civilization represented here has demonstrated the same capability. You have all learned to incorporate empathic strategic intelligence into your own approaches to problem-solving and interspecies relations. The confluence was right to value our perspectives. But they were also right to recognize that consciousness development requires cooperation rather than assimilation. In the silence that followed, the assembled delegates realized that Sarah Chen had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history. She had established cooperation with cosmic-scale entities while preserving the independence and value of younger civilizations. She had done it by understanding opponents so completely that they became partners, transforming what could have been conquest into collaboration that benefited all participants. And she had accomplished this transformation while appearing to be on the verge of physical collapse, demonstrating that human strength operated on principles that transcended conventional understanding of power and capability. As the formal ceremonies concluded and the new era of cosmic cooperation began, one question remained in every mind present: if this was what humans could achieve when they appeared to be at their weakest, what might they accomplish when they learned to combine empathic strategic intelligence with the advanced capabilities their confluence partners were prepared to share? The answer, they all understood, would reshape not just their civilizations, but the development of consciousness itself on scales that spanned the galaxy. The war room had become a chamber of cooperation, and the frail human who had commanded the art of war had transformed conflict into partnership through understanding so complete that opposition became impossible. In achieving perfect comprehension of cosmic-scale consciousness, she had demonstrated that human strength lay not in the ability to dominate opponents, but in the capacity to understand them so thoroughly that mutual advancement became inevitable. It was, the assembled delegates agreed, the most devastating form of warfare they had ever witnessed, victory achieved by making enemies into willing allies through empathy so profound it transcended the possibility of continued conflict.